So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for our last resiliency planning webinar. Today we are going to be looking at hazards and risks, what I plan for. And I have with me today our wonderful presenter, Annie Grunwald.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for either joining us in person today or actually online, or maybe you found this particular webinar on the web. In any case, we're happy you're with us and interested in this topic. So, as Jason mentioned, this is actually the sixth webinar in a series produced by the Human Services Council of New York, specifically for human services organizations, really strengthen resiliency, strengthen their emergency planning efforts. And this whole program wouldn't be possible without the support of the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene and the Florence V. Burden Foundation. So I want to make sure to thank both of those entities. We wanted to just give you the bigger picture of, before we dive into our risks and hazards, that this is a bird's eye view of all the materials that have been developed. So there are actual physical materials, and that is the Emergency Management Plan template and toolkit. And the template itself has a lot of sample language for you to use. It can be adjusted based on your size and your type of services that you provide. This appendices to the template, you don't have to use them all, but there are a lot of useful tools, operational tools and planning tools in the appendices. And then you have the instruction guide, which is the we're calling the toolkit. The webinars, we started with the foundation, right? So our first one was called Anatomy of a Well-Planned for Disaster. And we just took you on a journey of what it would look like for an organization to respond to a disaster after they've been engaging in planning efforts. Good introduction for all staff interested in understanding emergency planning, especially in the context of human services organizations. The second one, we go talk all about the tools. So we walk through all of these tools, give you a sense of how you might adapt them for your organization. And so that's something you might want to check out. The next one, we look at emergency management strategies. How do you build a emergency management program at your organization, no matter the size, that is strong and really has and create a culture of planning in your organization. The last few are specific to components of emergency planning. The first was incident management. How do you develop an incident management team? A team that will guide you through when there's been a disaster and you're having to run your organization in this disrupted state where many of your resources are affected. What does a meeting template look like? How often should you meet? What kind of questions do you ask when you meet? That's this webinar. And then we have continuity planning basics. And that is, we look at the process of identifying all of your services and ranking your services so you can develop strategies for keeping your most important services going when you don't have the resources to keep everything going. And finally, we come to risks and hazards, and that is where we are today. But before we get there, let's do a couple of other things in terms of showing you resources. This is what the tools look like on the HSC website right now. So it's divided into organizational documents. I'm going to show you this resources at a glance in a moment because it gives you a big picture of all the resources there are. Here is the template. We have a separate cover page. Here are the appendices. Most of them are together right here. Some are separate spreadsheets. We are going to be focusing on this one, this HVA tool, and you'll learn what HVA means in a moment, for New York City Human Services Organizations. Spent a lot of time on that today. And then there's the instructions. And then now we have all of the previous webinars are now on the web, on the links to them are now on the website, as well as a little description of each of them. So here is that tool at a glance. And I just wanted to point out, it shows you all of the sections of the template. It shows you that the toolkit follows the template. So if you want to find out more about how do I sort of populate this section on human resources policies related to emergencies, you can look at that section in the toolkit. This shows you what appendices are related to that particular section. And finally, it lists webinars that are associated with that section. So if you wanted to focus on continuity of operations, looking at your essential services, that's that webinar number 5 that we just held. Where are we today? We're here, right? So the reason why we have this tool, this hazard vulnerability analysis tool in the beginning, as we refer to it here, because in the introduction of your plan, you always want to set out what are the main hazards that you have to pay particular attention to, that you're at highest risk for. All right, enough of that. That gives you a sense of the broader picture of tools that we have for you. Now let's focus at the task at hand. So what are we going to do today? We always like to talk about terms because we love our acronyms in emergency management, get on the same page in terms of what things mean. And then we're going to talk about the process of conducting a hazard vulnerability analysis. What is it and how it can help your organization? Then we're going to look at a couple of tools, really. First is this hazard vulnerability analysis spreadsheet that we created specifically for you. You meaning human services organizations in New York City. So we're going to spend a lot of time on that, looking at the difference so you're comfortable with it, know how you can use it. And then we have another tool related to this, kind of a cheat sheet that we've created, we'll show you. And we're going to show you a couple of resources from New York City Emergency Management. You may know about them already, but we wanted to make sure to point them out. And then we're actually going to walk through the process of, I'm going to pretend I'm in a meeting and we're rating our hazards and we're talking about what kind of gaps we have in planning. And then we'll close it up with a few slides. All right, so our first term, hazard. This is an easy one. It's a potential source of harm, right? Anything that can cause damage to your people, your business, your stuff, right? There are potentially hundreds of things that can do this, we know. The term all hazards planning is bandied about a lot. In emergency management, we use it, we call all hazards plan. We have an all hazards approach. What that means to me is two things. So first of all, your plan should set down structures and procedures that will serve you no matter what the cause of the incident is. So that's things like your incident command structure, your communication system, your response teams in your organization, your human resources policies, your IT policies related to emergencies, all of that, all hazards. But also your plan has to take into account particular hazards. Why? Because they have unique characteristics that require a tailored approach. For instance, we're going to be talking about tornadoes a bit, but for tornadoes, you need to know the difference between a watch and a warning, and you need to know what specifically do you do if there is a hurricane. You don't do a general evacuation for a hurricane, you take specific actions. So many hazards have actions that you and plans that will be helpful to you have in place to either work around that emergency that happens, or especially mitigate the effects of that particular hazard. All right, staying with our language. Hazard we talked about, vulnerability, all those characteristics that make something susceptible to damage. And risk is really a measurement of that vulnerability, right? So those of you who watched or attended the webinar on continuity of operations, or COOP, we spent a lot of time focusing in on our essential services and really analyzing them, figuring out what are our vulnerabilities, how can we mitigate our vulnerabilities to lessen the impact on our essential services. So really all we're doing in this approach to doing a hazard vulnerability analysis is we're just changing the spotlight in this perspective. We're looking at vulnerability in terms of what that particular hazard can cause, the effects it can cause on our organization. So the goal is to have plans in place or take actions that will reduce your vulnerability to a particular hazard. So the questions that arise, if we say that's what our goal is, are what are the hazards that I need to plan for? Literally, we said there are hundreds of things that could cause damage to our organizations, our people. How can we measure the risk they pose? And how do we determine the actions that we can take to reduce the vulnerability? You may say, I already know. You may say, I have some response plans. I've got some hazard specific response plans. And those are the ones that I need to have. Okay, I say to that, you probably have something like a fire plan, but the reason you have a fire plan and it's ingrained in our culture is because we're at high risk for hazards, and the city has developed building codes, very strict regulations on the kind of suppression systems and fire brigades. They have school programs to teach children about lessening their risk of being affected by fires. That's ingrained in our culture. With other hazards, it's not. And it's a little difficult to find out what your risks are and how prepared you are for them unless you break them down. So in emergency management, we have a best practice for identifying hazards and their risks called a hazard vulnerability analysis, used by government institutions, health institutions, but it's really helpful in all kinds of organizations, and I really think it can be a useful tool for human services organizations as well. So what is it? Formal process of identifying your risks from hazards and associated impacts. We say it's location-based. So the reason it's location-based is some of your hazards based on where you are, either geographically. Let's say you're an organization that has a site in Brooklyn and a site in Bronx. Well, a site in Brooklyn may be on the edge of a hurricane inundation area. It may also have terrible drainage around it, so that makes it susceptible to rainwater flooding happens. Or it could be that, and then your facility in the Bronx isn't susceptible to any of those hazards. So it's location based. All right. So the other thing, so the why are you doing this? So it provides context to your planning efforts, right? Helps identify gaps in planning and prioritize your efforts specific to hazards. Both response plans you might be thinking about when you're doing this process that will help, or mitigation efforts to lessen the impact. It complements the essential service planning process. Remember, we said you're just looking at your vulnerabilities from a different perspective. And ultimately, it reduces risks, and most importantly, it empowers staff that they know what to do when certain kinds of hazards are affecting your organizations. All right, so I think I have this slide up here again. Okay. Just to show you again, remind you where the tool is, because now we're going to start jumping into this HVA tool for New York City Human Services Organization, Appendix 2. All right. Okay, so an introduction. We're going to actually pull up the tool in a minute and look at it, but give you a sense. 4 separate sheets. The tool itself is on tab 3. And then there are 3 other sheets that one helps you decide hazard ID guide. What kind of hazards should I put on my sheet? Then there's instructions there's going to be a lot of columns on this sheet. These are instructions for how to populate those columns. And then finally, there's an incident log that we'll look at in a moment. All right. So now I'm going to pull up the actual hazard vulnerability analysis sheet. Let me adjust this so you can all see it. I'm going to start with tab 3, right? Because this is the tool itself. So I want to point out some things here. At the top, you just have a place, your organization. Remember, we said it's location based. So this is where you indicate your location and the year, because we do recommend you review it every year. And so the first thing I want to point out, on the left-hand side, you have all of these hazards listed here. And we're going to talk about where this list came from in a moment. But it tells you, there's a little legend down here that tells you where we got these, why we listed these here. We have included, if you click on here, a little more information. So disease outbreaks, what does that mean? Naturally occurring disease outbreaks could be biological agents, different kinds of things, flooding from rainwater, flash floods, a little more information. When you may have other hazards, and when you put your hazards here, you can also add a note there to clarify a little more about what you mean by that hazard. All right, then the next thing we have, I had already populated this, but you can see that each of these columns, you can assign a number value to it, right? And that's all these numbers are gonna add up and tell you what your relative risk is. And so the first thing you're looking at is, how likely is a thing to happen? And I'm gonna just let somebody in. Okay. How likely is this thing to happen? Let's look at disease outbreaks. Well, how likely is it? It's pretty likely, right? We've at least moderate, because we have experienced an event, one of those very bad event we haven't seen actually ever in our lifetime. So the probability, we assign a number to it. And we're going to talk about how you determine these numbers. The human impact, maybe we say the human impact was very high for us. And when we're looking at the human impact, we're not just looking at the physical injury, but emotional, psychological, financial impacts of that. Skipped ahead. I was going to look at that yet, but and so we are assigning numbers to the impacts on our people, impacts on our property, and impacts on our ability to keep our services going. The next thing we do is we're going to assign numbers to our how prepared we are, because that's going to lessen our risk, right? Maybe we have a great plan now for a pandemic or an epidemic. We certainly have created a lot of great resources. Maybe we haven't written them down, so maybe we consider that our planning is maybe moderate for it. What kind of internal resources? Maybe you have mechanisms for getting masks and hand sanitizer and more laptops for remote work. So maybe you have terrific so that's a high internal resources to respond to this event. It's a citywide event. Maybe you would rate the external resources as a 2. And then you come up with a number. So the number alone doesn't mean a lot. It's really relative to the others, but it can show you how high your risk is. What do I consider the most important column here? Is this one. Planning notes. And I'm going to read this. I usually don't read my slides, but what does this say? It says, while you're doing this process, you're discussing what's behind the numbers, right? Why am I rating this this particular impact or preparedness measure the way I am? What are our strengths in this area and what are our gaps? And how did we come up with these numbers? And then you're articulating, then you start to get some ideas. How are you going to improve your lessen your risk to these kinds of events? So that's really the most important thing that I wanted to point out here. And we have a tool that has pre-populated some of this for you. It at least gives you a sense of what we think. No, actually, not this one. It's the next one, this next column. So planning notes are important. Do you have to take your notes in this column? No, you can do it any way that you want, but just take notes while you're doing this. The last column is called plausible worst case scenario. Well, what does that mean? That means you're defining what the event is that you're planning for, right? So let's say it's earthquake, for instance. We are not susceptible in New York City to a category 4 or 5, magnitude 4 or 5 earthquakes here. The most we would likely get is, I think, a 1 or in magnitude 5, I believe it is. So for earthquakes, the scales go up to 6 and 7, catastrophics are 7 and 8. So we could get mild earthquakes in New York City. The ones that we've had are very mild. You could sort of feel the shaking. But our plausible worst case scenario is that some stuff may fall off some of the buildings. Cars may be pushed away, could cause some damage. So that's important for you to know when you're deciding how prepared am I for this? What do I have in place for this particular scenario? All right, so we're going to look at that in a moment. Now what I want to do is go back and just go out over each of the tabs quickly. So hazard ID, this gives you instructions on how would you populate your form. We pre-populated with some things we thought are important for you, but you need to make your decisions based on this information, and we'll look at this in a moment. We kind of quickly looked at the instructions, right? And what I tried to do, I apologize for those who have a color blindness disability, because this might not help you, but it's a lot of information and these tools are very intricate. So I wanted to make sure that if you are trying to populate your impacts, you're going to go to your instructions and it's going to give you a little more guidance, just as we saw about the human impact. What do we need to consider there? Emotional, psychological impact on our clients. So that's going to depend on how old our clients are, what kind of disabilities, perhaps, what age they are, all of these things. Okay. Preparedness mitigation. This gives you a sense, well, what do I mean by preparedness? Well, what are the status of your response and continuity plans? Do you do drills and exercises? Is your insurance up to date? All of those things. So this is a helpful tab to actually give you some guidance when you fill this out, and I'm not there with you. Okay, the last tab is just a place for you to log your events. Why is this important? Because it creates a historical record. So not just for you, but really for everybody that comes ahead of you. If you've had 4 flooding events in a row, you haven't done anything about it, or maybe you have, and maybe you've made incremental sort of steps into increasing your resiliency for flooding. But it's good for everybody to know, why did it flood? What were the structural impacts? What were the programmatic impacts? We included some fields here that we thought would be useful for you. Do you have to use them all? Absolutely not. You can use what's useful to you. Do you have to keep it in here? No, you can keep a separate sheet of your of those events that affect you. Should you include all sizes? Yes, because sometimes those smaller events are really helpful or indicative of your ability to respond to larger events as well. So, big picture of all the tabs. Now, we're going to go back to identifying hazards and share with you some resources that New York City Emergency Management has. But first, I took this and I made a slide out of it that's a little easier to see. So the process of identifying hazards, you need to review your local state emergency management information because they're going to tell you all about what we're susceptible in terms of some of these technological disasters, some of these, all the weather related events that could happen. I say state because if maybe you have a satellite office somewhere in a county or in another state, if it's a very small jurisdiction, chances are the locality might not have information. Maybe you go to the closest city because they would have the most impactful, or maybe it's the state emergency management website where you get information on those hazards and risks. They're required to do in-depth planning and mitigation planning and that's part of the 2 resources I'm going to show you that from emergency management. Second is that you want to identify those threats and severity of threats based on your specific geography and location. We just talked about that. We talked about the poor drainage, right? That might not be the case if your building was somewhere else, or you're next door to an organization that provides reproductive health for women. Unfortunately, we know there could be a lot of picketing there that might inform how you want to train your staff, and so forth. So those are things to look at. Geography. You also want to see the geography of your building and the status of your building. Is it a modern building? Is it an older building that might present additional risks to you and your tenants? And lastly, you want to look at your clients and what kind of services that you provide. Certainly, if I was the senior center, if that's your facility, you wouldn't be at risk for a child abduction. But if you're a childcare facility, I'm sure you already have those procedures. Who can sign out children? Who can't sign out children? All of these things. So it really depends on the clients that you serve and the types of services that you provide. All right, now we're going to look at a couple of resources. 2 of them, the New York City Hazard Mitigation Plan. Again, you may know about these things, but this is the link. I'm not going to pull it up and show it to you. I'm going to show you a few static pages of this, very comprehensive. And then there is the hazards page on the emergency management website. So, sorry, this is blurry. I'm going to spend a lot of time on it, but basically the objective of the hazard mitigation plan is outlines goals and objectives, specific actions that New York City can take to reduce these global risks to the city. And so the most important part of this is there are 2 tabs here. There's an all hazards tab and there's a hazard specifics tab. Remember, we talked about all hazards and hazard specific. So I'm going to just show you what the all hazards tab looks like first and point out what might be useful to you. Do you have to use it for doing your HVA, hazard vulnerability analysis? No. But if you're curious about how many tornadoes have we had since 1895 in the city, or what is the city doing about hurricane mitigation? Are they putting up, what kind of structural things are we doing to mitigate the impact? This is your place to go. And I also want to point out this all hazards page has tremendous information about our natural environment. It talks about the built environment in New York City, the age of buildings, the sewer systems, all of this stuff, and then future environment. But the thing that I was really struck by is the social environment for human services organizations. There's information here that you could use for various kinds of funding, proposals. You're trying to maybe increase number of trees in an area. Well, there's a lot of fodder about what tree canopies do to areas, and how the absence of them creates a higher risk for heat emergencies. So it talks about population density, age, income, poverty, environmental justice, language, accessibility. Might be good information here for you. Not necessarily to do your HVA, but possibly. Okay, so the next hazard, the next tab that I wanted to look at, this hazard specific. Again, you might not use this because we kind of condense this information for you, but you're curious about coastal storms, want some more in-depth on that particular hazard, or earthquakes or extreme heat. This is the place to go. Now, most of you should know about the resources on NYCEM's, as we call, New York City Emergency Management's website. This is a particularly helpful one for this process. It talks about plan for hazards, and it's geared to individuals and maybe to businesses, but really you can extrapolate a lot of good guidance on what the hazard is and how do I prepare for it. So if you don't have good plans for particular hazards. So, all right, so I hope that gave you a good sense of where you can go for hazard information and just general vulnerability of the city. All right, so now what we're going to do is, I mentioned that besides this tool, that we have another tool that we really a cheat sheet where we pre-populated some of the probability, and we pre-populated some of the possible worst case scenarios based on information that we got from the New York City Emergency Management sites. So let's take a look at that tool for a moment. All right, so again, let's just look at it quickly. This talks about what the purpose of this, and we already said it's for guidance for determining the probability of a particular thing to happen and what the plausible worst case scenario for that hazard may be. It indicates you should use it with the HVA tool. This is something that is not on the website yet. We're going to send it to everyone after this presentation. We would love your feedback on it. Is it helpful? Is it not? What else might you find useful to add to it? So now let's look at what we have a disclaimer here that these are just possible ways, and you really have to look at your organization to determine what you think your probability is. I'll also say that this is not an exact science. So we say 2 or 3. So if you say a tool, somebody else has a 3, it's basically, is it higher on the 3 side, or is it 1 on the lower side, or maybe it's somewhere in between. And so what we did is, what we know that in many cases, the probability of a hazard happening, it's really going to be the same, like for hurricanes or tornadoes or a wind event. The same for all the five boroughs. So that's why we thought we could pre-populate some of these probabilities for you. You'll see in plausible worst case scenario the same thing. So it's winter weather. Well, what does winter weather mean? Well, looking at the history, we get a lot of snow. There have been blizzards, there have been sleet and hail. Is school closed for 2 or 3 days every winter? No, but that has happened. So we consider that the plausible worst case scenario. That's how you would center your planning efforts and judge whether you're prepared or not for that particular hazard. I want to go down here too. So we've divided hazards, as you probably saw, into natural, weather-related, technological events, and then these human events. And that's where it's harder for us to tell you what your plausible worst case scenario is. Depends on, again, most of it we say here depends on your history and other similar organizations' history. So looking at Bob threats, for instance, if the conditions right for that, if you know that there are people that don't like what you do, if you've had threats in the past, you might consider this, that you want some specific procedures. And there are great ones on federal websites about what do you do if somebody says there's a bomb, 2 or 3 pages, good procedures for staff. So it varies for your organizations. The same thing with threatening behavior, bias crimes. If you are an advocacy organization, only 4 or 5 people are in the building at a time, you probably don't have to have guidance on threatening behavior. But if you're a social service organization where you work with all different kinds of people, many kinds of people under stress, then you probably do, and you probably already do. All right, so this is this tool. Would love your feedback on it. All right. So now, finally, we're going to go back to our tool, but I took a couple of hazards from the tool. Let's do this, make sure you can see it. And I'm going to pretend I'm at a human services organization. I've gathered my team together and we're doing a hazard vulnerability analysis, but sorry, take out what I already put in there. Okay, so team, welcome. Thanks so much for coming. You all got your stuff ahead of time. So we're going to start looking at some of these hazards. And the first thing that we know we need to do is determine the probability of this happening. So we have that tool from HSC, right? So we're actually, and what we know kind of intuitively, we know hurricanes happen in New York City. We know conditions are right. So if we didn't, we would kind of look at this, didn't know what to think about. We could go to our instructions, but we know that we're susceptible, and looking at the probable worst case scenario, or the plausible worst case scenario, we have some information here telling us about, okay, heavy rain, high winds, tornadoes. All right, well, we're susceptible. I didn't think we were susceptible to a 5, but that's good to know, even though that's pretty bad. So this gives us a sense, all right, so this could cause a lot of damage, right? And we know some of us were around during Sandy, but we know that high impact, I would say, so let's say that this is a moderate, certainly could happen in New York City again. The human impact, I mean, honestly, a lot of our clients are immigrants. Many have fewer resources recovering from an event like this. They could be physically affected by it. Maybe they're not able to evacuate. I would say, and even on our staff, I would say it's a high impact on our folks. The property impact, let's look at the hazards again associated with it. High winds, okay. Not sure. Storm surge, we know, we did a lot of research on our main facility. We know we're not in an inundation zone, and we looked at the new ones as well. However, we are susceptible to wind damage, to the loss of electricity that's gonna happen that might impact our facility. So I would say this a 2, but it also makes me think about, we had talked about assessing all of our other facilities, whether they're in inundation zones. So even all of our schools that we work in, we'd really like to get a sense of, are they in inundation zones at all? So I'm going to put that on our to-do list of, we're going to look into that. I also want to think about, I don't really know what the impacts of winds are going to be on our facility. So I'm going to make a note that we want to kind of do some research on, is there something we need to do to mitigate against those winds? Our business impact probably could be a 2 as well, certainly going to disrupt our services. So now let's see, how prepared are we for this type of event, our plausible worst case scenario? Well, we've done a lot of work in the last couple of years, and congratulations, everyone. We have a strong incident management team. We put our team together. We used it during various events that we've had. But what I know we don't have is that they haven't really practiced for a hurricane event. So we want to make sure, I would say we'd wanted maybe our next scenario for our tabletop is a hurricane event, because there's a lot of information, that technical information that they should know about in terms of making decisions. And the city makes a lot of decisions before the storm actually gets here. So I think that's a high priority. Do we have, Matt, yeah, we do, right? We have a hurricane plan that was developed right after Sandy. Was anybody here during Sandy? No, nobody was here. So it's probably 5 or 6 years old at least, I think, right? So we need to look at that before we have our tabletop exercise as well. So we're gonna make note of those particular things. So I would say maybe we're attuned, preparedness, good general procedures, but no hurricane specific things that we are confident about. Our internal resources, I think, are fairly strong. We did talk about trying to figure out if we need some things to mitigate against wind hazards. So maybe we'll make a note of that. Consider that maybe a 2. External resources. Let's go to our instructions. What does that mean? Types of agreements that we have with other organizations, coordination with local and state agencies. Well, we do have good coordination, but we want to make sure we want to coordinate with all of our partners, community resources, time. Well, we have a really strong mutual aid organization, which we know was tested during, so we want to keep those ties up, because that would certainly come in handy during a hurricane event. And then we do work with we have our community planning coalition, our human services coalition that we work with, but we've never really talked about how we coordinate during emergencies, especially at the beginning of a hurricane, what kind of decisions. So maybe we want to revisit that, and we'll write down that task as something we want to look at. All right, we're doing pretty well. What's the next hazard we want to look at? So this came up pretty high, but we also articulated the things that we actually want to work on in our plan related to that. Tornadoes. What do you think, guys? We've never had what do you mean we've never had a tornado? No, we've had tornadoes, really? Okay, yeah. No, we have had tornadoes. You don't remember them because they haven't been that significant. It's not like we're in Tornado Alley, but we can experience, and we have experienced tornadoes a couple of years. We can look at this guidance that was on our cheat sheet. And then we could have increased frequency because of the number of hurricanes, because that's a related hazard for hurricanes. What we know, though, is that the tornadoes that have, even historically going way back, have what's called an F1 rating, or the worst case scenario is probably a high F1, and that could cause some damage. It could tear off a roof. It could cause some damage to create flying debris. So let's see, what does that mean to us? Maybe that means that we consider the probability is probably low. However, if it actually happens, if that plausible worst case scenario happens, I would say that we probably have a moderate risk for our people. It could be lower, but I would just safely say a 2. Certainly possible damage. Maybe our people is less than that. Maybe we say that it's a 1. Property impact, probably at least a 2, because if it does hit us, interruption of services, it certainly could interrupt services. It might only affect one facility, though, so maybe that is a 1 or a 2. We'll say a 2. Now let's look at what we have in place. Okay. Again, we have great response teams. We've been beefing up our program. So do we have a tornado response plan in our response guides? We don't? Okay, well, we probably should, right? Yes, I think we should. Because there are specific things. We want our folks that are doing, that are constantly scanning and getting alerts to understand what it means if you get an alert for a tornado and what they need to do at the facility if something happens. So I would consider this probably, our planning is a 2. We have some good shelter in place resources, meaning if we know that the conditions are right, we might want to keep people in place. And we have baby formula because we know we know our population that we work with, and some snacks and water saved aside. So we know that's pretty good. External resources, probably our emergency responders could be able to get to us fairly soon. So I would say that that is a high instance. But okay, our threat is relatively low, but we need a tornado response plan. Okay, I won't torture you any longer in my make-believe conversation with myself, but I hope it gives you a sense of how this works and how important the discussion is when all of this happens. And the last thing we want to show you is, what do you do with all the stuff that was identified? I am sure most of you have a good project management system where you're keeping track for any program or project of the things that you want to improve on it. It's especially important for emergency management because people are always saying, hey, we do this, or we should do that. We should spend some money on that. But a way of systematically keeping that information is really important. So we have yet another tool, not that you have to use ours, but we did, this is actually, I think it is Appendix 7 in your, in the appendices. And really, this is just a tool that we made so you can keep track of tasks that you said you're going to do that are going to improve your emergency plan. So for instance, I'm just going to show you the ones we said about hurricanes. Through the discussion, we thought we need to update the hurricane guide. We want to say who's going to do it. VJ's going to find it. Maybe there's a hard copy somewhere. And then we created some due dates. So first you have to create the hazard guide. Then we want to train them, or at least familiarize the incident management team on the coastal storm hazard guide. Then we have to do our annual tabletop focused on hurricanes. And so we just gave some dates to that in a natural sequence. Again, you may have another tool. You may have a fancy spreadsheet that you use, I don't know, Access or Smartsheet or something. Great, use whatever you want. Just keep track of things so you're having an historic record and you're not having to reinvent the wheel. That's the best way for people to lose interest in this, in the emergency management planning process. Okay. So our final slides, we're just going to kind of recap what we talked about. So the process in a nutshell is that you can use this tool. You're going to adjust the list of potential hazards based on all that information we gave you about how you determine which ones you're susceptible to. And then for each of them, you're going to consult tab 2, because that's where your instructions are. You're going to assign probability. You're also going to refer to this thing that we're going to send you, this cheat sheet that's going to help you consider what the plausible worst case scenario and what the probability might be. Then based on your organizations, you're going to assign values to the impacts, people, places, your things, your organization itself, values on what you've done already to reduce your risk, all your preparedness mitigation efforts. And most important, you're going to, while you're doing the process, you're going to document the reasons why you assigned the numbers that you did. And then you're going to consider the overall risk and the notes that you've taken and identify actions you want to take and add them to whatever project management. A lot of emergencies in the city. All right. And finally, some help getting started. So part of we preach that you should have a committee, however small it is. You should have a committee. Their responsibility is keeping up planning. Maybe they meet quarterly. So once a year, you're going to, one of the best things to identify what you need to plan for would be doing an HVA. And so you're briefing your team ahead of time, sending whatever things you think are important. Consider adding other team members to the process. It's a good way to sort of introduce new people to your organization in the things that you think about for planning for emergencies. The next thing is you want to plan how you're going to document your discussion. You're going to ask everybody to take notes. You're going to have one note taker. Most important thing. Going to start with your main, most complex facility. And once you have that, really, it's going to be a lesser process, unless, of course, you have branches in different states. Really, a smaller group can kind of compare what's different to this HVA. And then during the discussion, I mean, just good meeting etiquette, right? Encourage discussion from everyone. Use an electronic copy. If you're doing it online, certainly we're all used to projecting screen and somebody filling in the tool. Have instructions available so people aren't scrambling. And document both the strong elements of your planning gaps and the action and your gaps and the actions you want to take, because it's always, anytime you have an opportunity to congratulate everybody on how well you're doing, that is great. I'll also say that you bring in your information and your experience with all of the responses that you've had in the past. So that is a way of, maybe you haven't had an after action on it, but maybe you can discuss it and there have been things on people's minds that they wanted to talk about regarding that emergency. All right, so it brings us to the end. So what I'll say is that even if you don't think you're going to engage in this whole process, we hope understanding the logic of it is helpful to you. Of course, always modify it to your organization. This is not an exact science. You saw the way that we were just adjusting. Maybe it's a 1, maybe it's a 2. It gives you a sense, and it's a vehicle for the discussion. So as always, thank you so much for spending time with us. We are always looking for feedback. In this particular case, we'd love your feedback on the cheat sheet for probable worst case scenarios and probability specifically, but on all of the plans. We've already gotten some good feedback about, wouldn't be great to have some guidance on how to do a good tabletop exercise. So thank you again. We really appreciate your interest and your focus on emergency planning at your organizations.